Pass that down to Jeremy.
I'm going first.
Oh, you're
Thank you.
Cynthia, is this the correct PowerPoint?
So you're going first.
Okay.
I want to, before we begin, there are several people who have been instrumental in putting this event together, both for the Woodrow Wilson Center and for the Institute of the Americas. On behalf of the Institute, I want to specifically thank our Vice President Lynn Walker and Sherry White and Nora Lifesay, both of whom have come here from California. And to the Woodrow Wilson Center, I want to make specific thanks to Nikki Nichols, who's running around, and Adam Drolet, who's also here. There he is at the very back of the room. Thank them all. The focus of this panel will be to move on from our discussions this morning into an area which is of, I think, immediate concern to all of us, which is energy. And of course, with the events of today in the Gulf of Mexico and what we're seeing everywhere, almost on a daily basis, there is some major story about energy issues. The role of China in Latin America in relation to energy is something that is a story that needs to be looked at closely because it has tremendous implications, both for Latin America and China, and I would say for the world energy markets. We have a series of speakers who are particularly knowledgeable about energy, and we may talk about other topics as well. Jeremy Martin, who I will ask to go first, is director of the energy program at the Institute of the Americas, and I've asked Jeremy to give us an overview of what is happening vis-a-vis China and Latin America in that area. Dr. Hongbo Sun of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, who arrived last night, will give a Chinese perspective on goals and objectives of China vis-a-vis energy. Philip Yang is a former Brazilian diplomat, now involved in private sector, and he is active in relation to China, in the Brazil-China relationship, and can give us some information at, so to speak, ground level. And Dr. Cynthia Sanborn is at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima. I thank her for coming as well, just yesterday. And she has done research on China and extractive industries, not precisely oil, I think, in Peru. And her research, I think, is particularly important as we see China becoming more involved generally in extractive industries, in this case energy, but I think some of the lessons and some of the ideas and perspectives that she has, stemming mostly from mining, will apply to the oil patch as well. So let me begin with Jeremy Martin, who will give us an overview of what's happening in this hemisphere vis-a-vis China and energy. Yeah, I'm going to go sit down here, okay?
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all. Thanks to the Wilson Center, thanks to Cass, thanks to all our friends, thanks to the board of the Institute of the Americas for being here today. And I promised Jeff I'd keep this to 45 slides, so let me get right into it. He said 50, but I went ahead and cut it down 5. Actually, what he told me is 5 minutes, truth be told, so I really did prepare a short presentation. And I do want to just put out some strategic frames of reference and some ideas that I think maybe we can get into during discussion, and that's why I want to begin with this question. I want to talk and I want to posit a question for us to think about here. When we talk about Latin America and we talk about the Chinese interest in Latin America's energy sector, and I'm referring specifically to oil, and I'll pretty much keep my remarks to oil because that's what I've been following the most closely. Are we looking at China and Latin American oil as a panda or a dragon? Are we talking about a soft, cuddly partner, or is it the more fearsome and rapacious mythical dragon? And I think as I thought about this question, I came up with 3 more questions. So what I want to try and do is quickly run through a series of questions. So this is the broad question I put up here on this first slide. And the follow-on 3 questions, sort of a subset, are I want to talk about why, I want to talk about how and what, and I want to talk about where. The why, I think we've covered this to a large degree when we talk about the macroeconomics, but let me just zero in on a couple of issues here and get into why. And again, I don't think this slide surprises anyone in this room. In fact, I think it's probably one of the worst kept secrets on the planet that China's appetite for oil is booming, it has boomed, and will continue to boom. In fact, the International Energy Agency estimates that demand will more than double from roughly 8 million barrels a day today until to about 16 million barrels a day by 2030. And the other point I want to make on this is the prominence of imports when you talk about Chinese consumption of oil. And Chinese oil imports as a percentage of today's consumption exceed 50%. And this is extremely important when we talk a little bit about how and what, when we talk about some of the answers to these questions and why China is looking toward Latin America. So how and what? And again, given the tremendous surge in demand and a concurrent lack of domestic sources of supply to meet this demand, the Chinese have come up with a strategy that I've sort of oversimplified here, but it's important to look at these 3 key components of this strategy that Beijing is setting forth when it looks at overseas expansion. The first is material reserves, and securing access to and acquiring these material reserves. Secondly, securing access to and gaining production positions in oil projects. And then the third is as they secure reserves and production, they do so with an overarching aim to diversify the sources of supply. And this is extremely important. And I think just to boil it down to simple terms, what essentially we're talking about here is a policy and an effort and a strategy to assure that the oil reserve and production eggs are not in the same basket. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. And let me add one little point here that I want to differentiate from some of what we heard about in the opening session. And we heard a lot about the straightforward commercial nature of the Chinese interests and commerciality of Chinese deals in Latin America. And I would suggest when it comes to oil, that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, I think it's definitely not the case, as some of these, especially this last point, allude to. So I just wanted to make that quick differentiation in terms of, in the oil patch, what may not always be a straightforward commercial interest. But with that said, there's a couple of key points to run through here, following on my question of how and what. And in pursuing the goals of diversification, security of supply, and oil reserves, Beijing has been fortunate in the last few years to be able to rely on the economic windfall produced from the boom. But there are challenges. The world's oil has become far more difficult to gain access to. Indeed, while many folks in this room probably are familiar with or have heard of the term peak oil, the idea that we've peaked our oil production and we're on the other side, I think what might be more interesting and more accurate to talk about when we look at the Chinese strategy is the issue of peak access. In the fact that we are living in an era where there's not always easy access to some of the reserves. So when they were setting out to gain access to reserves, to diversify their supply sources, they're dealing with access issues. And in addition, in some cases, the Chinese did not fully grasp the cultural and political realities during the early forays into the hemisphere. And I threw up real quickly the Unocal acquisition and the tempestuous acquisition of the oil company Encana, a Canadian firm's assets in Ecuador. And both of these happened in 2005. And I think it also marks a demarcation from a sort of revision in the approach to overseas expansion on the part of the Chinese. And indeed, I think, I didn't put this on the slide, but I want to talk about where I see 3 modifications to the strategy for the Chinese overseas interests when it comes to seeking out energy supply. And based upon the 2005 issues with Unocal in the United States and Encana's acquisition in Ecuador, they came up with sort of a 3-pronged revision. And firstly, they decided to look more to mergers and acquisitions, largely through the purchase of local shares. Secondly, there was a much greater interest in doing joint ventures or special project companies, again, in partnership with a local or regional company, bringing in local and regional sensitivities and understanding of the marketplace. And thirdly, direct credit agreements became to be part of the arsenal of the Chinese strategy. And that's basically the typical long-term credit for oil swaps. And this third piece of the revised strategy post-2005 is something I want to talk a little bit about some more. And in fact, I think on my next slide we'll see that it may be one of the most important arrows in Beijing's quiver. But one of the final points I want to make about the post-2005 is there was a change in this desire, or a change in the strategy to focus more on the partnership element and the idea that they did not want to go it alone anymore after the Unocal and Encana lessons, and that they moved to focus again on partners, whether they be local, regional, but partnerships became a key word. So now the question I put forth as to where, and while admittedly this is quite a busy image, it quickly, I think, underscores the increasing geographical diversity of where the Chinese are in Latin America's oil patch. And for those of you who can actually read this, at least hopefully you can see some of the countries headlined. But on the left side, the Pacific side, I think it underscores what I talked a little bit about, which is the mergers and acquisition and partnership strategy. You see a lot of acquisitions and mergers and deals based upon this concept of not going it alone. But let me focus more here on this slide, and this is why I gave it the title of Chinese dollar diplomacy. And let's take Venezuela first. I'm sure everyone, in fact, I heard a question earlier today that referenced the headline that came out of Venezuela, and there was huge news about the inking of a $20 billion credit line from the China Development Bank. And as I mentioned in my last slide, and I talked about the credit deals that the Chinese were embarking upon, this is a perfect example. And it's a credit line that would be paid for with oil, and ostensibly it's to fund infrastructure investment in Venezuela. But it's also important to note that that brings the total of credit from the Chinese Development Bank to Venezuela to $28 billion. So there was already $8 billion disbursed in Venezuela as part of an oil for credit swap. And let me also talk about Brazil in this vein. And about a year ago, the Chinese and Brazilians embarked upon a similar credit for oil swap. And just recently, Presidents Lula and Hu Jintao formally agreed to this $10 billion credit line for Brazil. And as with the deal in Venezuela, this is a loan from the China Development Bank to be repaid with oil. It can be repaid with cash, but the terms are also over 10 years to be repaid with oil. And this loan, too, has received considerable attention, particularly in the oil industry, because it looks like it will greatly aid the state oil company in Brazil, Petrobras, as it undertakes a massive capital expenditure program for the deep-sea pre-salt fields in the offshore Brazil. So a few final points. And I think we talked again this morning about the economic windfall, and we heard a lot about the money. And I think it's important just to remind everyone, China has cash, and they're willing to spend it in Latin America in their aim to geographically diversify their access to oil reserves and production. But let me also add that despite all of the attention and the big-ticket credit agreements, the current amount of oil that China imports from Latin America is still pretty small. So let's be careful, I would suggest, not to over-exaggerate the current role of the Chinese in today's Latin American oil sector. And let me just give you one example. I talked a little bit about the oil for credit swap in Brazil, $10 billion. Well, Petrobras' 2010 capital expenditure program is about $47 to $50 billion. So when you look at it, and that's less than 20% over 10 years of what Petrobras is going to spend this year alone. So again, I think we have to understand that it's important, but sometimes we got to be careful not to over-exaggerate the importance. So let me return to my question. Are China's interests and appetite for overseas oil leading them to act as a panda in Latin America or a dragon? And I think maybe the early deal in Ecuador was something more along the lines of the rapacious dragon, just gobbling up the reserves regardless of what was left in the trail. But I would also suggest, again, returning to this 2005 demarcation, that the Chinese have learned a great deal and understand the need to be more culturally and politically aware in the countries where they invest in the region. And this is, I think, largely stemming from bringing in local partners and relying upon companies in the region to give them some of the insights that they, frankly, were lacking. Maybe the cuddlier, friendlier partner, if you will. So let me just wrap up by saying that, at least for now, it appears to be cheers y abrazos, particularly for Brazil and Venezuela. And I'll leave my 40 other slides alone at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. I should mention that we will, at the Institute of the Americas, in perhaps the Wilson Center will as well, post on our website all of the PowerPoint presentations that have been used today. For those of you who are furiously trying to write down how much Chinese investment there was in Trinidad and Tobago or what have you, you can come to our website, which is iamericas.org. I would now very pleased to present Dr. Hongbu Sun from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who will give us a Chinese perspective on what is happening in this area. Doctor.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I should say give my thanks to Ambassador Jeffrey Davido. Without his invitation, I can't be here. It's my honor. First, I like to my presentation focus on Latin American Energy Cooperation. Energy is a big topic. Here, I will focus on oil cooperation. In the past years, energy cooperation between China and Latin America very important and achieved agreement. Make many achievements. Yeah. According to this section arrangement, I have 4 questions I think worth discussion. First is how the Chinese nation oil companies and Chinese government will further invest in Latin America. Second, what are the obstacles? What are the expectations for the future? And the Chinese national oil companies concerned about political risk. This question also discussed in Beijing among the business circle and the scholars. First, I'd like to say, what's the dynamic rules promoting Sino-China, Sino-Latin American energy corporations? I think there are 4 factors which should be emphasized. First is strong economic growth, China. Second is national companies. Third is government. Finally is financial organizations. You can find that China financial organizations are very active to promote energy cooperation. It's China Development Bank that provided loans in Brazil, provided loans in Venezuela. I think national oil companies are very active. From these graphics, we can find that strong economic growth created national companies of Chinese oil companies. They pushed Chinese financial organizations in the world market. They have their own international strategy. We call it globally. They have their local market orientations. They are profit making. In terms of government, they like to secure our energy security. I think if we analyze the role of government, I think it's cooperation promoting and policy service. I think the new trend is that China national oil companies is very cooperative with financial organizations. I think it's a new trend. Yeah. What's the cooperation models? I think there are 5. Technical service model and joint development and the infrastructure building participation model, loans for oil, biofuels technology joint research. I think what most important is technical service, infrastructure building participation. In the some media describe China is a hungry dragon in Latin America. What's the truth? I think many corporations focus on technical service and participating infrastructure building. Thirdly, how important Latin America for China's energy security? We can find the figure. Latin America only accounts for 7.58% in China's total crude oil importing around the world. Yeah. I think it's very difficult to imagine Latin America will become a highly strategic region for China energy security needs because we should consider in Latin America their supply and demand dynamics. Yeah, there's some programs with China oil service in Mexico, in Venezuela, and in Ecuador, in Colombia. Yeah. Covered program by country. I think in terms of exploration in Peru, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina, we have this kind of programs, development, yes, service contract, loans for oil. I think in the past decades, in past years, we have some government, for loan for oil. Yeah. This is a general country introduction. Yeah. China is patient with providing technical service in Mexico. The third is Colombia. We cooperate with an Indian company. Yeah. I think Sino-Venezuelan cooperation is a very important component of bilateral cooperation. Thanks to the support of the two governments and the joint effort of the process, both sides have deepened further cooperation in oil exploration and development, engineering, and technology services, trading, transportation, and refining. In Ecuador, I think Ecuador, we provide many the technical services, not only for China, not only for the companies of Ecuador, also providing services for the international oil companies. I think now important is China's oil cooperation with Brazil. Yeah, in the joint action plan we signed last month, you can find that we emphasized that both sides will promote and extend the two-country cooperation in oil trade, oil exploration, and development, financing, engineering, and services. China and Brazil will cooperate in developing new sources of energy, particularly renewable energy. I think in the future, China will regard Brazil will be a potential opportunity for China to develop their energy cooperation, particularly exploring their offshore oil reserves. Yeah. What's the opportunities? For China, I think that high economic growth and China's and also investment capacity. Third, I think most important that I think China national oil companies have localization experience in the past. I think better understand the local market. I think very important. Yeah. For Latin America, I think they keep their energy industry open. There is insufficient investment in exploration, development, and refinery. Third, I think important the political willingness. I think important to promote the bilateral energy cooperation. Yeah. The challenges for China's national oil company. In China, we have discussed what challenges for Chinese oil company investment in Latin America. I think policy uncertainty, regulatory framework, and social risks. How to deal with relations with local communities and intensive market competition. In Latin America, not only Chinese oil company and Latin America, Russia, India, there are many international oil companies. I think the competition is very fierce. The third is environment clauses. Now we discussed the spill oil in Mexico Gulf is very serious environment clauses. The third transportation costs. In the first sections we discussed the trade. The transportation costs I think is not a problem. Third, technology of refinery. We find Latin America the heavy oil. I think it's a very problem to develop our technology. The third, U.S. response. In Beijing, some professors discussed what's the U.S. response for China energy cooperation with Latin America. I think it's worth discussing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sun. Philip, you've actually been doing business in China, so come and give us the truth.
Okay. Good morning. Ambassador Davido, Cynthia Narson, Paulo Sotero, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here with you today. It's been 10 years since I left the Brazilian Foreign Service. And, let me just set up this here. It's been 10 years since I left the Brazilian Foreign Service. And this is actually the first time I speak to a non-financial community. And I'm very happy that it happens here at the Wilson Center. My topic here today is China's energy plans and implications for Latin America. My remarks here will follow three main propositions. First, China's oil policy is the facet of China's energy policy that matters most to Latin America. Second, the Chinese presence in Latin America, and especially in Brazil, is very meager, much below what it could be. And third, there is an untold story about oil exploration in Brazil that opens room for a much greater role of China and the United States in Latin America. But this is our secret until I finish the presentation. You will realize that my approach departs from an investment perspective. My approach is also very much focused on the oil sector and is constructed from a Brazilian standpoint. The idea is to depart from this specific standpoint of investment, oil industry, and Brazil, to then see if we can derive broader energy and foreign policy implications for Latin America and the Triangle. So let's then go back to the first proposition. China's energy policies are very broad. A staggering expansion of the energy mix is taking place there in a very diversified way, from renewables to the nuclear power. But it is China's growing oil demand and the country's reliance on oil imports that matters most and bring about implications to Latin American countries. This happens because Latin America, and Brazil in particular, are one of the world's most successful oil exploration frontiers, and this combined with the fact that China emerges as a global source of foreign direct investment. So we have a combination of a resource-rich, capital-scarce region on the one hand, with an oil-hungry, capital-abundant country on the other hand. I think this has been covered already, but I wanted to show it once more again. The graph on the left shows the consumption of China. It's 8 million barrels per day. And China is producing 4 million barrels per day. And you can see the gradients of the curves. There's no way oil doesn't play a very central role in China's energy policy. And on the right, you see China's annual overseas foreign direct investment flows. So in spite of all this, of this complementarity, actually, China is not present in Latin America. Or at best, China has a very meager presence in the region. This is my second proposition. I think this echoes most of the commentators here today. If we consider the overall presence of China in Latin America in terms of investment, non-bond investment, we get this chart. This slide shows the Chinese investment stock around the world. Latin America accounts for only about 1% of this total stock. I don't know whether you can see the black stripe on top is South America. It's less than 1% of the overall stock of foreign direct investment made by China. And this map is a very similar map that Jeremy presented, except for the fact that this one plots only the equity investments that China made in the upstream sector. So we are not considering here any credit facilities that China has made to any country. These are upstream, actually, on the ground, in the ground investments made by Chinese oil companies. And then if we contrast China's presence in Latin America with Africa's, the China's presence in Africa, we see how different it is. It is much more overwhelming. And we may wonder why. I'm proposing here 3 different ways to explain China's investment behavior. One possible explanation is that China has a clear investment preference, which is targeted to 2 main types of destinations. The high-trust societies, where the rule of law prevails with clarity, and on the other hand, countries with loose regulatory framework. It's far. Yeah, okay. So let me get back then to my first thesis. My first thesis in terms of how to explain China's presence in different countries is the following. The one is China perhaps has a clear investment preference, which is targeted to 2 main types of destinations. The first type is high trust societies, where the rule of law prevails with clarity. And the second type is societies with loose regulatory framework. This hypothesis would explain, for instance, the strong priority that the Chinese are giving to, say, Australia and Africa. Australia, by the way, was the top destination of China's foreign direct investment last year. And China's presence in Africa is widespread, as we saw in the previous slide. This hypothesis would also explain why China is not present in Brazil. Brazil, in many ways, is somewhere between high trust and loose regulations. Another explanation is that China adopts a sort of confidence-building ladder to approach foreign countries. The steps of these ladders are trade, and then services, and then investment. This means that whenever a preference is not very clear, China would begin the approach with the trade of goods, and then evolve into the provision of services to then finally start with investment. And if we see the data between China and Latin America, we see that the process is ongoing. Flows of trade grew dramatically, and then services also increased, but not much less so, and in only a few countries. The third step of the ladder, investment, has yet to come for Latin America, and I think everyone is coinciding with me on that. Thus, according to this explanation, many countries in Latin America and Brazil have not yet climbed the level of total confidence for China to invest. Still another explanation is the political motive, in the sense that Chinese NOCs would combine their oil interests and investment policies with Beijing's quest for political and strategic influence. This hypothesis would explain, for instance, the presence of China in the upstream of Ecuador and Venezuela, and the total absence of China in Brazil. I think these 3 visions are very much stylized here, but they are combined one another to make China's presence worldwide. Now, finally, let's then move on to my third proposition, which is the untold story. It is a story about Brazil, but I believe we can draw implications for the triangle. This untold story is both an explanation of the current absence of China in Brazil, and also a prescription for a greater collaboration of China and US in Brazil with spin-offs to Latin America. This untold story is hidden here in this graph, which shows the evolution of oil production since the beginnings of the oil industry in Brazil. What happens is that this slide is used to showcase the outstanding performance of Petrobras in the exploration of the offshore deep waters. What is neglected in this graph is that the onshore was totally abandoned. Everyone looks at the upper blue portion of the graph. The staggering success of the offshore in Brazil simply shadowed and continues to shadow the vast onshore of Brazil, which remains underexplored. it is generally implied that the lower brown portion is an indication of low prospectivity of the onshore. What is not clearly said is that Brazil onshore received very low levels of investment from Petrobras during the monopoly years. This picture is obviously an overall blessing for Brazil, which became one of the world's most successful frontiers of offshore oil exploration, but also a curse for Brazil's vast onshore, which was then virtually forgotten and abandoned. Let's remember one important fact. From 1953 to 1998, Brazil was under a monopoly. So if Petrobras was unwilling or unable to give attention to the onshore, there was simply nobody else to do the job. And Petrobras gave utmost priority to the offshore, deep waters, assigning the bulk of its budget and best brains to deep water exploration. To give you a quantitative idea of the under-exploration of Brazil's onshore, I prepared this map here, where Brazil, China, United States first, and then China are drawn to scale. These three countries are very similar in terms of their size, but now let's look at the exploration activity. The US drilled over 3.5 million oil exploration wells so far. China, there is no official number about drilling activity there, but anecdotal information from sources in the industry state that about 1 million wells were drilled there. For Brazil, we have a scant figure of 23,000 wells. This is really insufficient for such a vast territory, especially when we consider that whenever investment was made onshore Brazil, oil was found. Independent certification companies such as DeGolyer and McNaughton have recently indicated that the potential for hydrocarbons in Brazil's onshore may have the order of magnitude similar to that of the offshore, and with much less risk. So this is the untold story. Brazil's onshore was forgotten and underexplored. This is not so Brazil is not limited to the pre-salt. There is a horizon which is beyond the pre-salt in the onshore. The second part of the untold story is not only untold, but also very fresh news. It derives from results of a private study, which is now being prepared again by DeGolyer, which reveals that Brazil's onshore also emerges as a new frontier for unconventional gas. So the second part of the untold story is this. Also in Brazil, there is an unconventional natural gas revolution underway. And China and the US may certainly play an important and historic role in the exploration of these resources, which will certainly be untapped in Latin America as well. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm the last dance between you all and lunch, I realize that. I want to thank very much the Institute of the Americas and the Woodrow Wilson Center for providing me this opportunity to come and speak to you. I direct a research center, a social and economic policy research center at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, Peru. And I'm also a member of the National Working Group of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which is a global initiative working to make more transparent taxation and revenue flows between large mining and hydrocarbons firms and governments around the world. And Peru is the first Latin American country that has signed on voluntarily to this initiative. And I am going to speak today more about the mining industry, which I've been doing research on, relationship between firms, governments, and communities in mining. There are some very similar trends to what my colleagues have mentioned in the energy sector, which I will touch on. And first of all, I think we've all really covered quite a bit today the issue of context. I just wanted to remind us of some other issues in the context. Of course, global demand and fierce competition for the resources that Latin America has to offer. All major multinational firms in mineral exploration and in hydrocarbons are present in Latin America, as well as the large state-owned enterprises from China and elsewhere. They're all seeking our commodities. And as has been mentioned here, we have to put the Chinese presence in perspective related to other firms that are also here and have been here for some time. We have, as the panelists mentioned in the morning, some very renewed development concerns in the region about what this bonanza means. And I think that Enrique Garcia and others touched very importantly on the real concerns of policymakers about diversification, about avoiding some of the resource curse, economic and political implications of previous eras of commodity bonanza. This involves rethinking the role of the state, and it's very important. We've seen diverse responses in the region to how to manage the oil and mineral and other natural resources that we have, how to strengthen public institutions, as something that Enrique Garcia also mentioned very importantly. We've seen a range of responses from Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Peru. The other contextual factor I think it's important and has not been mentioned so much by other speakers is the context of political democracy. Very lively, very vibrant, very tumultuous political democracies, which is something that's distinct from previous eras of bonanza commodity development in the region. We have a diversity of actors who now have a demand and a right to be involved in the debate about how to manage these resources and how to regulate investment. We have non-governmental organizations that are global in their strategies and activities. We have indigenous and native communities organizing to demand rights and access and a voice in how these resources are managed. We have the Catholic Church and other religious organizations taking a strong stand, along with environmental organizations, about how to control some of the negative environmental and cultural impacts of large-scale extractive industries in the region. In other words, it's not just governments, local and international governments, it's not just firms, there's a whole lot of other folks involved with the right to be so. And the issues involved are distinct. The issues are about who has the rights to the property under which the minerals lie, in the case of Peru. Do communities have a right to veto or to have a voice in whether concession is made and to who it's made? Do communities have a right to share in the revenues, and what is the revenue distribution that's fair? How much do the companies take, how much local communities get, etc.? The whole array of issues related to environmental impact and the need to regulate and reduce the negative environmental impacts that these kind of activities tend to generate. They're all on the table with more or lesser degree in different countries of the region, but I think it's a very different playing field for any investors, including the Chinese investors. We also have a context with higher global standards for the industry. We've had a lot of changes, the ICMM, the EITI initiative, and others in which firms, largely Western firms, have signed on voluntarily to raise their conduct both in community relations and environmental impact and the kind of technology investments that needed to have cleaner industries to much higher standards than in previous eras. And that's something that I think Latin America has been on the forefront, and the country I live in, Peru, has been especially concerned about these issues. So in this context, the questions that I was asked to address were the following. In this new context, what are the development implications of expanded investment by the Chinese state-owned enterprises in particular? Do the Chinese firms and the government behind them behave differently than others in this region today? Do governments behave differently with them? What can we learn from recent cases? And our research institute has been doing some in-depth case studies, something that Jeffrey mentioned, looking at specific experiences of firms in Peru and neighboring countries in the Andean region, of how Chinese firms have negotiated with governments and local communities. What can we learn from these and draw up from them? And what more do we need to know, which is a long list of things, I think. Before jumping to some of the cases, to the extent that time will permit me to do so, I'll jump to the conclusions. Some of the observations we've drawn from our in-depth case study research. We've also been preparing teaching cases for our business school for folks that are going to be operating in this industry very soon. As everyone has said today, the Chinese interest in our region is primarily oil and minerals, but also the relative social stability. And I think this is something that Philip alluded to. The relative stability of our political structures, of our societies, the relatively greater local capacity for negotiation vis-a-vis African partners. I think that's something that's being increasingly valued on the Chinese side. Chinese investors are being actively recruited by our governments and by potential partners in the region, so the presence may still be relatively small, but there's a real effort out there to increase it on our side. We're primarily seeing the larger state-owned enterprises, but we're also seeing a diversity of other types of firms. In the Peruvian case, we have 8 of the large Chinese firms operating. We have 6 of them that are clearly state-owned, several of them that are partial private and public. We even have individual families and small investors buying up concessions and lots with the idea of making some money on them down the road. So there's quite a diversity when we talk about Chinese investment, even among the larger ones. What do the Chinese offer in general when they come to invest in our mineral sector in particular? Broad agreements between governments. This is something that's been mentioned before. Package deals. It's not only about getting to the copper or getting to the iron. It's about building the infrastructure. It's about strengthening the deep water ports. It's about improving the transportation lines to get the minerals to the ports and other activities. A position vis-a-vis our governments that I'd call accommodationist, and this is something that's been looked at. A gentleman named Ruben Gonzalez has done a study of Peru, Ecuador, and other cases as well. So when the rules change, the Chinese have been very flexible about adapting them. So the taxation and investment rules in Peru may be one. Rafael Correa in Ecuador changes the rules. Some of the larger Western firms have had a harder time accommodating them and accepting them. The Chinese have been very willing to do so. No, it is in Venezuela and elsewhere. They're putting more money on the table, as several have mentioned, greater access to finance when others have not always had it. And, of course, the appeal of access to the Chinese market with a larger array of goods that we hope to export and that we are exporting them. We've also seen increasing concern, and this is something that the Chinese colleagues have mentioned, increasing concern by the Chinese government about the behavior of their extractive industries at home. Great leaps in terms of trying to consolidate their industries and trying to clean up the environmental impacts that have been so damaging over history in China. And the same firms as they're investing overseas, I think the Chinese government has taken increasing concern with trying to make sure their behavior and the image they give of China overseas is the best possible, including encouraging the larger, more modern, more advanced firms to take the lead in investments. This said, however, that we're finding in the cases in the countries in which we're doing research, those Chinese government directives are very hard to implement from far away. The Chinese government may require, expect, and demand that its large firms provide the best image possible, but especially when host governments in the region are not as strong or have the lax regulatory framework that some have mentioned, or when the firms involved are not the national champions that have a direct link to the central government authority and the Communist Party officials in China. It's sometimes from word to deed, there's a big gap. The Chinese firms as a whole that we're seeing in the region have very limited experience with community relations. In a democratic, free, open context, they have very limited experience with negotiating with multiple stakeholders, as they are expected to do now in our region. They tend to assume that governments will resolve the social problems. You make a deal between the government of China, between the government of Peru or in Chile. The government promises that they'll deliver the goods in terms of previous permission on the part of communities, cleaning up the land right and property right disputes, etc. Well, in some countries, in particular the one I live in, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen if the government provides its word. And I think there's been some real learning on the part of Chinese that you have to work with other actors and not just with the central government officials who provide you one picture or one part of the picture. A very limited vocation for dialogue, for addressing the media, for responding and discussing what the company plans are and who they are, etc., don't giving interviews. And the lack of transparency in terms of how the firms are operating, what they're planning are, what their financial situation is, that in part, I think, is this lack of culture of transparency with China state-owned firms in general, and in part the distance in language. And a Chinese colleague who was in Peru for a semester said, well, you talk about lack of transparency, but we have a lot more out there in Chinese that you can't read. So and at the same time, their Spanish language translation skills are weak. So there is a significant part that's culture and lack of customary transparency, and a part of distance in language as well. The Chinese firms are not participating in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, in Publish What You Pay, and all the other global initiatives that are taking place. And their local counterparts in the region. We have dialogue groups between firms, NGOs, environmental groups, etc., roundtable discussions to try to reduce some of the conflicts and try to move forward with more consensus about these issues. We don't see the Chinese firms at the table at all yet. They're delisting their acquisitions as they're buying up junior firms. They're taking them off the stock markets in the West and making it even harder to find information about them. And there are very few effective channels for communication. If a researcher in Peru or in Chile or in Ecuador wants to study one of the large firms now operating or conducting explorations in their country, the local staff that have been sent from China very rarely have authority to speak from the main office. The folks that they've hired locally have a limited amount of what they're allowed to say to the press or to scholars and researchers. And for those firms that are mixed property or privately owned in China, the ability to contact their shareholders or have any kind of active activism in regard to them is pretty unlikely. With the time permitted, I'd like to mention a few of the cases, 3 of the cases in particular, in Peru that stand out for the following. Beyond the details of the cases, some of the evolution and learning that has taken place on the part of the Chinese investors, as well as Peru and Peruvian officials and society, as well as some of the things that still aren't being learned on both sides that I think are of concern. Peru, as many of you know, is a country that is indeed increasingly dependent on minerals. Minerals are now 62% of our exports, a quarter of our tax revenues, 6% of our GDP, but in some regions of the country, in increasing regions of the country, that's exploration and production activity. That's a significant share of the national territory today. It's up to half of GDP in some of the regions of the country today. So it's very important activity. I think Peru now receives 26% of Chinese worldwide minerals mergers and acquisitions, and 34% of mineral investment in Peru today comes from China. So it is important. It may be on a relative scale to where China is operating, but for a country like Peru, from our perspective, it's very significant. The very initial investment projects, big ones in Peru, go back to the early 1990s, but there's been a real wave since 2007 and at the present time. China, as of last week, was still our number 2 trade partner, but I understand now some projections put it at number 1, largely because of the mineral bonanza. Peru is implementing now a free trade agreement that was signed with China, a very important one that kind of goes beyond what the Chilean agreement establishes in hopes of opening those markets to other goods that we have. The Peruvian context for investing in minerals and natural resources more broadly is the following. Peru is a country that has largely privatized all of these industries after having negative and difficult experiences with public firms. Private investment, foreign investment in particular, has been encouraged since the early 90s with very favorable tax and legal measures, encouraging firms to invest, providing tax stability contracts and other things. And since 2006, since the APEC meetings and the expansion of Chinese firms overseas, Peru has really been courting China and Chinese investment across the board and in the mineral area specifically. At the same time, I would venture to say that Peru has a relatively weak capacity or will on the part of the state to regulate the firm's activities once they're on the ground. And it's not, there's a lack of will. The encouragement is on investment rather than on regulating and modifying firm behavior. There's also a lack of capacity in terms of environmental issues, in terms of technological issues, to really monitor what firms are doing. So it's an ideal context from what Philip mentioned. There's a series of challenges in Peru that I think are similar to some of the other countries. We do not have a property rights regime that is well defined. The community property and community proper rights are under discussion. Private landowners and what their requirements are when concessions are granted to the minerals underneath their property. Rights to water and who has priority is a fundamental issue right now, and a fundamental source of conflict between investors across the board in these industries and local communities and local municipal authorities. What are the environmental regulations and what standards are we going to hold firms on the ground? Peru has good legislation in this area. It's difficult to enforce that legislation in very remote, high mountain and distant areas. Labor issues, there's been a great deal of flexibility about hiring. Nonetheless, the mining sector has highly qualified labor, well-organized unions. Growing concerns from indigenous communities about their voice in this picture. And even the church, which, as I mentioned, in Peru has taken a very forthright position in demanding corporate social responsibility in the extractive industries. Quite an activist position, actually, that has scared some of the church authorities themselves. We have increasing levels of conflict around social and environmental issues, not just about where the money goes or how to distribute the revenues that are being generated, which are significant, but conflicts between communities and firms about alleged pollution, about real pollution, about use of water, or fears that there might be pollution and lack of information about what is being done by the firm to reduce that. And one thing that's important in this case is that the state is on the sidelines. Public authorities do not make that effort to prepare communities when concessions are made. They grant a concession, they throw the firm out there, you deal with the community, you explain to them what you're doing, you put it in simple terms. It's a very difficult position for the firms themselves. And the Chinese are investing in some very conflictive cases in Peru. I don't know if it's the same around the world, but in this case it's particularly significant. And I'll just mention 3 of them briefly. This is the broader list of investments that we have. Total estimated almost $7 billion in investment in minerals in the next 5 years. So we're expecting more direct investment from China in this sector. And as Philip mentioned, China was also a very early investor in our oil industry, our dilapidated and declining oil industry, and now the effort to revive it. And although it's a small player, China, in the region, China now, or Chinese investors account for 40% of total oil production in Peru, particularly through their partnership with Plus Petrol. They bought out almost 50% of Peru's Petrol's northern holdings and therefore have a significant investment there, both in the Amazon and on the coast. The first case I'll mention briefly is Shugang. Shugang really was a history maker in Latin America. It was the first firm that Peru privatized after the Fujimori administration decided to privatize this entire industry. And it was the first foreign investment for China in Latin America of this scale, as I understand it. It was the one and only iron mine in Peru, and Shugang, a very old firm in China, bought it up. Shugang had a series of problems from the start. They did try bringing hundreds of Chinese workers. They were resisted emphatically by the Peruvian workers in the Mine Workers Union. They tried to lay off union leaders. They got in trouble for laying off union leaders. Subsequent firms have not tried in Peru, and I don't think elsewhere in Latin America either, bringing in hundreds of their own workers. They entered into conflict with local governments about water and electricity. The firm controls water supply for the community in Marcona. That's illegal. Peruvian law requires turning this stuff back over to municipal authorities. Shugang has decided not to do so. They've been criticized for outdated facilities, they've been fined for not complying with environmental standards that have been applied for them. Their initial investment commitment was not honored. The government assumed a significant debt for the firm. There have been 3 investigations into possible corruption around the way the firm was privatized. The latest one, the firm really came out and said, can the investigation, or we have a $700 million expansion project on the boards, we're not going to move forward with this. We may try and jeopardize other Chinese investments. So they've played hardball with the Peruvian government, and the Peruvian government has really backed down on this. I think that the investment potential in iron ore in this case has been more significant than cleaning up some of the behavior. So although Shugang began in an earlier phase, for both for Peru and for China, it continues to be a problematic case in our country. The second case is a consortium of 3 firms led by Zijin, which is a large gold producer and now multi-mineral producer in China. It's a case of environmental concern on the northern border with Ecuador in an area that's not accustomed to having mineral development, and which the communities involved are adamantly opposed to the idea of mineral investment of any sort. The Chinese bought this project from a small UK junior firm. They were actively recruited. They were the only bidder. Nobody else wanted to touch it because of the social and environmental complexity involved. Evidence suggests that there were both Peruvian and British diplomats that really encouraged them to take on this project, probably without due diligence. That's what some of the analysts are saying today. President Garcia, when he traveled to China in 2008, met the CEO of Zijin and promised that he would resolve some of these community conflicts. Well, President Garcia can't deliver that kind of promise on the ground in Peru. Maybe others can, but he certainly can't. So it's a case in which the project has not gone off the ground. It's on a standoff. There's been considerable and ongoing violence between local community leaders and the investors, and the Chinese have yet to really figure how to move forward with this project or cut their ties, as the case may be. The third and final case we looked at is the case of Chinalco, which is a large national champion, a firm that has a direct line to the Chinese cabinet and the Chinese Central Committee. They have invested in a project that requires moving an entire town from spot A to spot B in order to build a large open pit mine where the townspeople are now living. Chinalco did things differently, and I think a lot of evidence suggests that this is learning over time. Chinalco hired the best CEO in the business, which was the head of the Antamina copper mine, which is a world-class Oxfam poster child mineral company operating in Peru with a great deal of investment in community relations, environmental impact reduction, etc. They hired largely non-Chinese staff with considerable experience in the industry and in community relations. They had extensive commitments to invest in environmental cleanup in the area, even though they are not responsible for the environmental damage. There's damage done by other firms, state-run firms, for generations. They've agreed to invest in cleaning up an acid water treatment plant and others in the area. They've been very engaged with the local community, local authorities, high levels of social investment. The plebiscite was held. The majority of the community agreed to move. In other words, it is a case of learning. It is a case of trying to do things differently that the other 2 cases didn't suggest. It's also a case where they really had deep pockets and direct support of the Chinese government to do so. So I would say that this is a case most likely to succeed. I just wanted to mention some of the things that Chinalco's doing that I think is the only Chinese firm in Peru that's doing, from taking Congress people to China to see their plants in China, a course that they organized with our university on social responsibility and sustainable development in mining, in which they provided training for congressional aides and staff, or we did, and they paid for it. They sponsored women's volleyball championship, which is a very popular sport in Peru. We have Olympic champions in women's volleyball, unlike in soccer. And as I said, the commitments to rebuilding a town and moving 5,000 people with due care to what their needs are and to paying a fair price and buying new homes and that kind of thing really represent a significant difference from the previous firm's experience in the country. Conclusions I draw from these and other cases that we've looked at is that the Chinese investment does represent a major opportunity for us, as others have said. But controlling and limiting and channeling to a positive degree the development impacts at the national level require, above all, the will and capacity of national policymakers to do so, as well as the role and vigilance of civil society organizations in keeping firms on their toes and governments complying with the laws on the books. When this is not the case, as is in Peru, there's a high potential for conflict with these investments, and I think higher, in fact, than some of the Western firms that are more sensitive to some of the concerns I've mentioned. At the local level, we still have a great deal of reliance on the voluntary action of firms in order to avoid some of the more negative impacts. And again, the Chinese have less experience, but as the Chinalco case suggests, they're fast learners. And finally, I would just say that I think we all, living in Latin America, Latin Americans and otherwise, need to learn urgently more about the Chinese firms and the government policies behind them. The Chinese have been investing heavily in Chinese language and history training through the Confucius Institutes and others. But we need to learn a lot more about their economy, about their economic policies, about their firms and their investment decisions. And that's something that we in the university sector are trying hard to promote. So I'll leave it right there.
Well, thank you for 4 excellent presentations from different perspectives. We have time for some questions. So as we did after the first panel, raise your hand. We'll take 2 or 3, and then we'll move from there. Nikki has a microphone. This lady in the balcony, yes.
Hello, my name's Stephanie Lloyd, and I'm a research associate with the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. And Mr. Philip Yang said there is a limited Chinese presence in Brazil and that China receives much more oil from Africa. This disparity is probably because Africa is in much more desperate need of FDI than Brazil is currently, because currently Brazil's economy is doing pretty well. However, there's a question general for the panel, but specifically for Mr. Philip Yang. Does the panel believe that if Brazil were to get into dire economic circumstances, that perhaps Brazil would maybe decrease its regulations and would receive a definite increase in China's presence? Or does the panel believe that the cultural differences and geographic distance is too great for a much more increased relationship between China and Brazil?
Okay. Somebody else have a question? Yes. Dan?
Dan Erickson with Inter-American Dialogue. I want to bring up a point that came up early in Cynthia's presentation about how she said that China has been accommodationist in terms of dealing with local changes and rules or regulations, whereas I guess by comparison the U.S. or EU are more sticklers or taking on legal battles. And because the examples that were cited later in your presentation, Cynthia, kind of gave a mixed view of that. It seemed at some point China wasn't very accommodationist at all. It actually was taking on some local battles, and maybe there's been some evolution there. So I was wondering if you could just maybe delve into that a little more and also address that to Philip Yang, since you're in the practitioner side. Because there's a perception that China's extremely hard-nosed, tough negotiator, isn't go along, get along. And then that contrasts with an accommodationist view. Thank you.
Yes, back there.
Jason Fargo with Energy Intelligence Group. This is another question for Philip Yang. You had mentioned that currently, popular guy, that there isn't a lot of Chinese investment, particularly in Brazil, in the oil sector, but there's this wonderful opportunity on onshore, which is underexplored. Could you explain a little bit about how we get from point A to point B what would need to occur. And also, at the beginning of your presentation, you had presented 3 hypotheses for, why Chinese investment in the Latin American oil sector has been relatively meager. I mean, are all of those hypotheses ones that you endorse? Is there any? Were those just sort of possibilities, or could you elaborate a little bit more on which, if any or all of them, are likely to actually be the real case?
Okay, why don't we look at these? First question relates to whether, I guess, relates to all countries in Latin America, specifically asked about Brazil, whether if those countries were to get into more difficult economic circumstances, would they be less rigorous in terms of what they demand of foreign direct investors? Philip, did you want to take a chance at that?
Yes. Let me try to address. These questions. I don't know if I took them all very clearly, but well, there are perhaps China's reasons for not being more present in Brazil, and there are also Brazil's reasons for not having China more intensively in Brazil. As for China's reason for not being present in Brazil, I think we go back to one of those categories. Brazil is too complex a country. It has regulations which are similar to very developed countries, high-trust societies, but the implementation of these regulations are somehow fuzzy, and the chains of command in Brazil are very complex. Brazil is not a country for amateurs. We used to say that in Brazil. And this is one of the reasons why China is not more present in Brazil. So China is looking for more ways to come to Brazil. And one way China found was striking a $10 billion loan facility with Petrobras. Why? Because, well, pre-salt is a target for China. And this is a very direct way to the chains of command in Brazil, to the commanding heights of Brazil, to have a proximity to the pre-salt. I don't know. I doubt whether that was a right target, because there are many uncertainties regarding the pre-salt. One is the regulatory framework for the pre-salt. The others are related to technology and safety and so forth. But anyhow, that was the way China found to approach Brazil.
Philip, before you go on,
yes.
It was interesting in your graph, you showed that 81% of Brazil's oil reserves are in deep water. But I think it's also important to point out just how much of production is in deep water.
Right.
Which is very small, if at all.
Yeah, onshore production, yes.
No, deep water.
Deep water is very high. It accounts for 80%, more than
of reserves.
Of reserves.
What about production?
Productions as well. It's very high.
Very high.
Production,
okay.
Currently, we are producing, I would say, 2.4 million barrels per day.
In deep water?
In total output. And onshore production accounts for only 200,000 barrels per day. So
in the next big jump in Brazil would be to the pre-salt.
Yes.
Which is much deeper.
Much deeper.
Fine.
Much deeper.
Okay.
Much deeper water depths.
Fine. Thank you. Please continue.
So on the Brazil's reasons for not having more of China's presence, there are a combination of a number of factors. I think one of them is a certain conflict between, or not conflict, but a tension between industrial policies, investment policies, and labor policies. We need to address a large labor pool, which needs employment in Brazil, and usually China provides services in the destination countries, with bringing in a pool of labor force, and this would be an issue for Brazil. We cannot absorb a massive labor force in Brazil with the regulations that we have, and this would be in the confidence building ladder. That would be a necessary step to have more Chinese service, but to need more Chinese services, we would need more Chinese labor, and this is a tension in Brazil. And of course, we need investment. If we take the perspective of Petrobras, for instance, in the coming 20 years, we will need perhaps $1 trillion in investment to untap the potential of the pre-salt reserves. This is a huge amount of investment. Of course, we want this, and we need this to untap this resource. But at the same time, we are concerned about the Dutch disease. We need strong industrial policies to address local content and local technology, local industry development, and local development of technologies as well. So there's a tension about among these three components of policy: investment, labor, and labor, investment, and what is the third? Labor, investment, and exactly. Thank you. Industrial policy. Thank you.
Cynthia, there's sure.
Just a quick. About the regulation, I just want to make because there's a debate in Brazil. There's actually four laws submitted by President Lula last year to Congress that are under furious debate to look at the pre-salt and how the regulatory framework for the pre-salt will be handled. And I just want to make one point that I think is interesting. That when you go back to some of the points I made, I think, and I would submit that the Chinese, one of the key elements of the new regulatory framework for the deep sea pre-salt in Brazil will effectively give Petrobras a majority stake in operatorship in all pre-salt reserves. This is something quite anathema to international oil companies. It's something that basically they view as they don't want to play by those rules. They don't want to basically be a banker. I think this is an important distinction with the Chinese, because we go back to some of the points I made when you talk about security of supply, you talk about geographical diversity, and I think that they wouldn't be turned off by that new kind of regulatory framework that might eventually come to the fore in Brazil vis-a-vis the pre-salt. So I would just add that one little point that, when we're talking about changes in regulatory structure in vis-a-vis China investment. So
well, this is something we see throughout Latin America, that national oil companies are more interested in doing business with other national oil companies than with international oil companies. That's a somewhat of an overstatement, but it is a fact. Cynthia, you want to clear up that accommodationist
Well, I
question?
think actually that's what I was alluding to, these new arrangements and new demands on the part of governments also in Ecuador and Bolivia and Venezuela. My sense is that Chinese have been more willing to go with the flow on it. They don't have a long history of dealing with other regimes or having greater demands, and have been able to accommodate. The Peruvian case is one in which there haven't been too many demands. There's basically full encouragement for Chinese and other investment. The one case I mentioned, the case of Shugang, in fact, it's the opposition in Congress that has been demanding investigation. It has been municipal authorities on the ground that have been demanding that the firm turn over water and electricity supplies and stop controlling them directly. But the central government authorities have backed the firm or looked the other way and not tried to enforce the legislation on the books. So it's not a case in which there's been direct confrontation with the central government. It's been with more local level authorities. However, if Peru in their next elections have a radical shift in resource nationalism, if somebody wins the election, it doesn't continue the current policy, which we of course don't know what's going to happen. I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese were there for the long haul with the kind of investments they're projecting in minerals in any case in this country. I wanted to make a comment and a question for the rest of the panel and all of you. After the Shugang experience with bringing in Chinese labor and finding widespread opposition to that, I would be interested to know if there have been other cases. Several people have alluded to the fact that when the Chinese invest in large long-term projects, they want to bring in their own labor force. But I haven't seen that happening in Latin America. And given the conditions in Brazil and Chile and elsewhere, I'd be very surprised if, in fact, that was the case. I'd be curious to know if there have been other cases of that in middle to large-sized countries in the region. I would imagine that the demands that our own labor force take up those responsibilities would be foremost.
Anybody have a comment on that, Dr. Sun? No?
I would like to say something about China's energy operation with Brazil. In China, we look at that in Brazil, there are many opportunities. You can see that Petrobras every year they make promotions in Beijing, attract the technical service. We have built a boat for Brazil. I think not only get the blocks, I think in industrial and the industry, inside industry, the cooperation, I think we should expand our standing I emphasize the potential cooperation with Brazil. The second, I think that for China, we have different standing about the government. So sometimes the businessmen, Latin America, with some problems. Yeah.
Fine. We have time for a couple of more questions. One in the back, one over here, and Cynthia. Okay.
Yeah, my name's John Atchley, and I used to be...
Please hold the microphone to your mouth, please.
Can you hear?
Yes?
I used to be the petroleum attaché in the American Embassy in Mexico, in Venezuela, and in Nigeria. One thing, the comment about all the difficulties and the fact that maybe Latin America would not become a highly strategic region for China. If I were doing some political advising, you'd think you would want to say to the Chinese, well, Brazil, for all the problems that have been mentioned, looks like the best prospect because Mexico's never been able to get over the 1937 nationalization and the power the unions assumed, and their fields are declining, and maybe they won't be a good source for exports. They will consume most of their oil internally and may even wind up importing. And as far as Venezuela goes, it seems to me that Chavez opened the door to China mainly because he wanted to poke a finger in the eye of the United States and the private oil companies. But you're looking at a country whose oil fields were damaged by government efforts to ramp up production very quickly after the 2002 PDVSA strike, particularly the large eastern oil fields. And where production is falling, the western oil fields have a very high rate of decline. So again, maybe China would be looking at a source that's not as secure as it looks. The very heavy oil deposits there are going to take a very, very long time to turn into anything. So Brazil, in a sense, would look like the best prospect in Latin America. I wonder if you could comment on some of that.
Right.
Good afternoon. Philip French, retired State Department. Just have a question for Dr. Sanborn. I'm curious, the examples you give of Chinese investment and some of the problems they had, especially on the social corporate responsibility side, whether you saw any distinction between the way they were treated or the reactions or perceptions towards Chinese investors and when it comes to either the local community or the national government, as opposed to the way other multinationals, U.S. or European, hunt oil comes to mind. Was there any distinction between how those two different development, or I should say investment, were treated? Thank you.
And we had one final question. Oh, Cynthia.
Cindy this time. Cindy Arnson from the Wilson Center. I have a question which I guess is directed mostly to Cynthia, but perhaps for all of the panelists, which has to do with the potential for conflict around Chinese investments, either in extractive or, energy production. A lot of the resources that exist, I mean, Brazil within the country, in Ecuador, are in fragile areas where there are significant indigenous groups. And I was wondering whether you see the potential for more conflictivity around, of the nature that Cynthia was describing. And if so, at what point do the sort of transaction costs of doing business in Latin America become really unattractive to Chinese investors?
Okay, three good questions. Very quickly, I'll ask anyone on the panel, is Brazil the best bet for Chinese investment in oil or petroleum and hydrocarbons in Latin America? Jeremy, if you were going to put money in?
Yes.
Okay.
Although Colombia could be interesting, but I'm not sure about the scale. But in terms of regulatory and investment framework, Colombia, Peru. But yeah, Brazil. I mean, the pre-salt is the pre-salt.
Enormous, yeah. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay. Cynthia, with two questions on corporate social responsibility. In essence, Mr. French asked if Chinese companies are treated more rigorously or more hostilely than other multinationals. And Cindy was asking about potential for further conflict with indigenous groups and others, and ask you and anybody else who wants to make a comment.
On the treatment side, it wasn't clear if your question was about how it's treated by central government or by other actors. I would say that although the Peruvian government position has been encouraging to private and foreign investment across the board, there's been I think a greater degree of tolerance and permissiveness and stronger encouragement without enforcing the rules with the Chinese investment, particularly in the framework of the FTA negotiations. I mean, Peru is very interested and now very pleased that we were able to sign a free trade agreement with China last year and active in terms of implementing it. So anything that could rock the boat there or be seen as rocking the boat is a particular concern. I mean, there's broader interest there at heart. I think the treatment that Chinese firms get by non-governmental organizations and local authorities and activist groups is one of not knowing how to deal. I mean, I think there's probably a lot more attention paid to large Western firms that have shareholders you can lobby, that have international forums you can go to, that have Western banks supporting them that are sensitive. And certainly the environmental movement, which is important in the Andean region, has worked a lot harder and dealt a lot more with the Western firms and put a lot more scrutiny on them because they can and because it's easier to do so. Part of the research that we've undertaken was precisely to ask some of those questions and what more do we know about the non-Western investors, particularly the Chinese investors that are coming into the country? What previous track records do they have elsewhere? What might we expect in order to know how to deal with them? And this is in a context where non-governmental organizations are critical in a series of issues about real regulation rather than what's on the books. In terms of social conflict, I think investors find social conflict everywhere in the world today because there's been a real globalization of demands and concerns about these industries. But in Peru, the principal and increasing source of conflict in the country, and there's the Public Defender's Office keeps track every month, and there's something like 140 active violent conflicts going on in the country, is around large extractive firms and communities. And it's a growing source of legitimate and direct concern on the part particularly of rural and indigenous communities and environmental groups. And it's also going to be politicized. It is already being politicized heavily. We're in an electoral context this year and next year for local and national authorities, and it's going to be ever more political. Now, given the fragmentation of our political system, it may not be something that leads to a significant change in the overall government direction. We don't know who's going to win the elections in 2011, but it certainly will make transaction costs and learning challenges much more difficult because you're dealing with actors that have the ability to stop projects, to block off roads, and to make it harder to get a project underway.
Well, this has been fascinating. Let me ask each of the panelists, I'll give you 30 seconds each for a final thought, if you have one. I'm sure you have final thoughts. Jeremy, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'll just say something that really hasn't been mentioned. One of the elements of the Chinese national oil companies moving to Latin America is they want to bring an integrated approach. And I think one of the things that I would add is when we talk local content, we talk what's happening on the ground in some of these countries. I mean, part of the idea is to bring an integrated company. So you have the national oil company that includes service companies, and you have a fully integrated. And so they want to bring the entire realm of experience to the table. And I think that could be interesting as we see strong local content laws in Brazil and how they reconcile some of those issues. And just going back to something somebody said about Mexico and this element of service companies. And there actually are Chinese service companies that are, as I understand it, engaged in Mexico. So although Mexico is closed to upstream investment, it's a bonanza for service companies, or it has been a bonanza for service companies. So I would just throw that final thought into the equation, the role of the service companies, the national oil company, and their integrated service companies.
Sure. Philip?
I would like to go back to my untold story and tell one more detail about that story, which involves the United States in the beginnings of the Brazilian oil exploration history, which is Petrobras was founded in 1953, and in those days, Brazil didn't have a critical mass in geology and geophysics. So the decision there was to hire an American geologist, a famous one. He was called Walter Link. He was a prominent geologist working for Standard Oil. And then he came to Brazil in 55, in fact. He arrived in Brazil in 55 and remained in Brazil until 61, with the specific duty to make a study to indicate, to survey the potential of onshore Brazil. And his conclusion was very interesting. He said, forget about the onshore. Brazilians, you will lose time if you explore oil onshore and just go to the offshore. That was in late 50s. So then so Petrobras devotes the company, the efforts to the offshore already in the beginning of the 60s. And by 1968, Brazil strikes the first discovery in the Guaricema field. So when the company is only 15 years old, there is this first discovery in an offshore field. So from that point on, the onshore is totally abandoned. And this explains why there was a path-dependent track towards the offshore in Brazil. I just wanted to clarify. This is a very interesting historical event that involved the United States. I think that puts very much in perspective what happened and what happens still today when everyone is just looking to the offshore.
So you're blaming the United States for this unbalance. Dr. Sun, very quickly.
I think first point I'll make, China is a constructive partner in Latin America to develop oil sector. Second is that China worried about from perspective of companies is a policy uncertainty. The third is that China have learned better just how to communicate with local communities. I think in the past 2 years, the Chinese oil companies in Peru, I think in Ecuador, I think do a lot of work about the social responsibility. Thanks.
Cynthia?
Okay, two things. One, I think that all of this suggests that while we should not give undue and prejudicial attention to the role of Chinese investment, I think there's a tendency sometimes to create myths or start with certain prejudices. But we need to put objective, and constructive, and rigorous attention, particularly, I'm speaking for the research community, and engage with and get to know better the different Chinese actors that are investing in the region as others. And I guess the other point would be, I think the different presentations made today and in the morning really point to the capacity of national governments and others within the countries to be able to negotiate with any kind of investors, particularly the kind of deals and opportunities that Chinese are offering. And we really can't be putting so much responsibility on the Chinese when it's really about what we put on the table and how we negotiate with them, as well as any others. Thank you.
Well, before I thank this panel, I just want to make a couple of other notes. First, I want to thank you all for coming. I specifically want to thank the members of the Board of Directors of the Institute of the Americas who have come and spent this morning with us. They've come from several foreign countries, including California, Mexico, Venezuela, Dominican Republic, Argentina, Canada, Chile, Brazil. I thank them for being here with us. I thank all of you. The Woodrow Wilson Center has been a great partner for the Institute of the Americas, and I thank Cindy and her staff for everything that's been done. The board of the Institute will be meeting, there's no rest for the wicked, we'll be meeting immediately after this on the fourth floor, along with all the speakers who are invited to come to that meeting as well. And finally, I want to thank the members of this panel. I think it has offered us fascinating perspectives in all of the speakers this morning. And we are finishing on time, which I think is quite incredible. Thank you very much.